There is a truth about life that many refuse to accept. It is an idea so fundamental, yet so discomforting, that most people spend their entire existence avoiding it. But Carl Jung did not avoid it. He embraced it, studied it, and built his understanding of the human psyche upon it. This truth, that suffering is the foundation of true wisdom. Jung understood something that modern society often forgets. We are told that happiness is the ultimate goal, that life should be free of hardship, and that suffering is an obstacle to be eradicated. But Jung saw things differently. He believed that suffering was not just unavoidable, but necessary. A man who has not suffered, what can he possibly know? He once asked. This is not just a rhetorical question. It is a challenge to anyone who seeks to understand life deeply. Think about the most profound lessons you have learned. Did they come from comfort, from ease, from the times when everything was going your way? Or did they emerge from struggle, from pain, from moments when you felt lost and broken? Jung believed that every psychic advance of man arises from the suffering of the soul. This is not just poetic philosophy, it is a psychological reality. Jung's work in psychotherapy reinforced this idea. He observed that many of his patients were not suffering from any clinically diagnosable disorder, but rather from the senselessness and emptiness of their lives. And what did he see at the root of this emptiness? The refusal to suffer. Neurosis, he said, is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. When people try to escape suffering, they often create more suffering for themselves in the form of anxiety, depression, or addiction. In their attempts to avoid pain, they make their suffering chronic and inescapable. Jung saw a profound parallel between human suffering and religious symbolism. He wrote that if God wishes to be born as man and to unite mankind in the fellowship of the Holy Ghost, he suffers the terrible torment of having to bear the world in its reality. He himself is his own cross. In other words, the act of taking on suffering, consciously, willingly, is not just an individual experience, but a universal one. It is the foundation of transformation. This idea echoes in many traditions. The Buddha left his palace to encounter suffering and attained enlightenment. Christ bore the cross and achieved resurrection. In mythology, the hero must always descend into the underworld before emerging wiser and stronger. These are not coincidences. They are universal patterns, deeply embedded in the human psyche. But what does this mean for you? How do you apply this in your own life? Jung's insights suggest that suffering should not be avoided, but faced with awareness. Facing suffering does not mean passively enduring hardship. It means engaging with it, learning from it, and using it as a vehicle for self-discovery and transformation. Consider a simple example. Imagine two people lose their jobs. One falls into despair, feeling like a victim of unfair circumstances. The other, though experiencing the same pain, sees the loss as a chance to reflect on what went wrong, to learn, to grow. The second person carries their suffering with awareness, using it as a catalyst for transformation. The first person, in contrast, denies the suffering and remains stuck in bitterness. Jung made a crucial distinction. Suffering without meaning is destructive, but suffering with meaning is transformative. People are never helped in their suffering by what they think for themselves, but only by revelation of a wisdom greater than their own. He wrote, "This means that suffering must be connected to something larger than the self, be it a purpose, a vision, or a spiritual understanding. The key, then, is to suffer in a way that leads to insight rather than destruction." But how does one do this? Jung suggested that meaning is not simply found but created. When we face suffering, we have a choice. We can allow it to consume us, or we can mold it into something meaningful. This is why many of the greatest artists, thinkers, and leaders throughout history have emerged from profound suffering. They transmuted their pain into wisdom, their despair into insight. Nietzsche, a philosopher whose ideas parallel Jung's, once wrote, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." Jung also pointed out that our entire educational system suffers from a one-sided approach. We focus on teaching children skills and knowledge, but neglect to teach them how to suffer. When adversity comes, many are unprepared. They collapse under the weight of hardship because they were never taught that hardship is not the enemy, it is the teacher. Imagine if schools taught young people how to endure emotional pain, how to sit with discomfort, how to face failure without collapsing. Imagine if parents and mentors encouraged resilience rather than avoidance. Jung believed that our failure to teach this is one of the greatest flaws in modern society. A compelling example of suffering as a path to wisdom can be seen in Nelson Mandela's life. Imprisoned for 27 years, he endured immense hardship, yet instead of succumbing to bitterness, he used his suffering to cultivate wisdom, patience, and resilience. When he emerged from prison, he chose reconciliation over revenge, guiding South Africa toward healing. Mandela's journey exemplifies Jung's insight. Suffering without meaning leads to despair, but suffering embraced with purpose transforms both the individual and the world around them. There are countless other examples throughout history. Take Dostoevsky, who faced imprisonment, exile, and financial ruin, yet his suffering gave birth to some of the most profound novels in history, exploring the depths of human nature. These individuals did not avoid suffering. They integrated it into their journeys, using it as a source of strength. Jung's ideas even apply to the struggles of everyday life. A person recovering from heartbreak can either close themselves off from love forever or grow wiser in their future relationships. Someone who faces rejection can wallow in self-pity or develop resilience and perseverance. Every painful experience offers an opportunity to shrink or to expand, to suffer mindlessly or to suffer with purpose. This is why suffering must be seen not as a curse, but as a gift. It is through suffering that we learn the most about ourselves, about life, and about what truly matters. When faced with adversity, the question is not, how can I avoid this? But rather, what can this teach me? If suffering is approached with curiosity rather than fear, it becomes a gateway to wisdom. Jung's perspective on suffering is not easy to accept. It goes against our instinct to seek comfort, to avoid pain. But once understood, it is liberating. If suffering is inevitable, then resisting it is futile. The only choice is how to suffer, blindly, as a victim, or consciously, as a seeker of wisdom. This is why Jung said, the principal aim of psychotherapy is not to transport one to an impossible state of happiness, but to help acquire steadfastness and patience in the face of suffering. True wisdom does not come from escaping suffering, but from enduring it, understanding it, and ultimately transcending it. Suffering is not an obstacle, it is the path. And as Jung reminds us, those who have not suffered, what can they possibly know?